Go.
Already.
Awesome. Well, happy March, everyone. We're halfway in. So hopefully during the course of this session, which is our third, it will feel like we're at the halfway point. The good news is, and hopefully as we go through this, we'll see that, we've started corralling all the info and hopefully putting in a framework that will help the advisory panel in terms of think about where to prioritize and how to shape the recommendations. But, and that is a big part of the goal today. It really is to continue from the discussion last time where we just showed you kind of at first blush, here are some of the areas that had come out of the submissions, as well as to start kind of constructing frames of looking at the information and even profiling each one of the opportunities against some of the things that you said would be important to look at, like, for instance, state versus local. And so you'll see that, a response to, this presentation is partially a response to that input. So anyway, with that being said, let me get into it, and then we can hopefully get to a discussion pretty quickly around the meat of this. But before I start marching down here, I'd ask, Representative Waymaster or Mark, any thoughts or comments you'd want to make up front?
The only comment that I would probably make up front is I hope everybody has looked at the submissions and the kind of the changes that were made since the last meeting. And I'm sure that through this meeting, we'll have more discussion on those items that were submitted. But I just hope everybody has taken a while and looked at some of those submissions that we're going to be looking at, because if you kind of jump ahead in the slides, you'll see that there is far more requests than there are dollars available. And so we're going to have to be diligent on exactly how we're going to be moving through the items in this advisory panel and make sure that we identify those that we think need and must be funded, because there are a lot more requests out there than there are dollars available.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, you kind of jumped forward on some of my thunder there. But anyway, go to the next slide. The next slide on the agenda basically just lays out the approach, give them more kind of context about where we are in the process, and then really diving into the detail around, filtering the submissions and having discussions around the programmatic areas. And if we can get to it, being able to potentially even kind of craft the top line summaries of the programmatic areas, which would house the ideas and the submissions, as well as potentially other things, depending upon where the advisory panel wants to go. And then talk about next steps, so how we use the second month of this to continue kind of the prioritization and fleshing out around the most important areas from the advisory panel standpoint, for the group to be able to put forward to the Spark Executive Committee at the end of the day. Once again, we're just trying to be helpful in terms of process support and decision support around this. So let us know if there's anything else over the course of this that you'd like us to take a look at to support the advisory panel in that effort. Go to the next slide. So once again, in terms of where we are in the process, we're in that kind of light blue filtering stage. And over the course of the discussion today, my guess is as we get into the detail of how we've categorized the submissions and profiled them around a number of things, probably some areas, some kind of categories are going to just start falling out. Per what Representative Waymaster says, there are probably some that just even as a category really don't make sense. Or even within a category that makes sense, there may be some specific areas that don't make sense. So my guess is there will probably be kind of some honing in around that today. That will allow us to be able to work with the panel between this session and next to be able to kind of create the discrete bite-sized portions, recommendations that can then be scored in the next session against each other. On the next slide, this is the slide that Representative Waymaster was alluding to. So in terms of the submissions, there were 758 submissions. And once again, there could be ideas beyond the submissions that the panels themselves come up with, but there were 758 ideas. And in total, they accounted for about $13 billion in asks. And, of what's available is 721 million. And so, in this area, it was 900 million. So lower than most of the other areas. That being said, what the Spark Executive Committee is going to need to be looking at is that 721 million. So that highlights a couple of important areas. One, the need to prioritize. And even now to say, where are the areas we really want to hone in to do more work on and, make sure we can put the best rationales forward as a panel around those areas. And then, and I know that both Representative Waymaster and Mark have talked about this along the way, is really just identify ways to extend the funds, right? In terms of cost shares, anything else that can happen so that $721 million can have a lot bigger impact than that. Go to the next slide. So once again, where we are in the process, we're at meeting 3. The next meeting tentatively, we don't have it exactly nailed down. So this is just kind of an approximate date, was around the 18th or so. So a couple of weeks out, we're going to need to nail that down after this session, hopefully. And that's where we would have kind of the defined programmatic areas, and we'll be in the process, we will be able to score them in anticipation of putting kind of a recommendation forward. Go to the next slide. And sorry I'm running through this, but I know we're going to want to get into that detail. One thing to kind of talk about a little bit is, I keep talking about programmatic areas of strategic focus as opposed to projects. And the way we've been describing it is, there are going to be a number of different things that come out of every panel. In some cases, it's going to be something that is one or more projects that are specific. In some cases, it's going to be things that are more like a grant program, that's going to look for people to apply. So we're just kind of calling all of those things together programs. Now, what the advisory panels are going to do is be able to say, here are the programmatic areas that we're recommending and why. And then, so it can't approve projects because the Spark Executive Committee is going to get more requests that it's going to be able to fulfill. And so the Spark Executive Committee is then going to say, here's what our integrated priority set looks like across those things. And then it still needs to go to the State Finance Council. And even after that, on a number of these, there still needs to be a way of being able to administer this. The panels in the Spark Executive Committee, and we need to kind of craft the best way to do this, is going to be able to define what's in those programmatic areas, where it's specific projects, it's specific projects. And if anything deviates out of that as you're going through the procurement, as required by state and federal guidelines, if it goes outside of those requirements, there needs to be kind of a discussion with the Spark Executive Committee. But there still needs to be kind of a follow-on step. We just need to make sure that it's in accordance not only with guidance, but also in accordance with the wishes of the panels of the Spark Executive Committee as well. Go to slide 8. So now we are going to start diving into actually the details that we need to go through in terms of potential areas to prioritize and thinking about as we kind of grouped it based on your input on the last session, as we grouped it into areas to look at, how the panel thinks about relative priorities. We started getting some feedback in the last session in meeting 2. And so here are 3 of the, go to the next slide, of the top line things that we had heard in that session. And it even led us to approach some of the filtering of the submissions and the programmatic areas the way that we did. So what we heard last time was Investments in state agency programs should be considered prior to local investment needs, or at the very least. We need to understand the difference between the state and the local investment needs. Not to say that we wouldn't make any, we would try and satisfy every state agency need before a local investment need, but we needed to think about them probably a little differently. And that was particularly with regards to, we really need to understand if there are local sets of funds that could handle some of those local investment needs. Investment should avoid establishing programs requiring ongoing funds. So we don't want to create any new long-term budget items. So we've tried to look at that. And investments should be made in areas that have largely allowable programs and where existing funding is insufficient. So we need to really be thinking about these things in the context of the sweet spot for this set of funds. And even beyond that, and we're going to show this every single time, the guiding principles from the Spark Executive Committee, because these are the things that group is going to be looking at as it weighs which programs, which recommendations to go forward with. And it actually, what we have on the left side of the slide reflects a lot of what's on the right side of the slide in terms of, prioritizing those sustainable programs and investments, one-time use of funds, combined with other sets of funds wherever possible to extend them, things that are going to, foster long-term systemic impact for Kansans. So, think about things that are broad enablers with lasting power over the long term, and maybe, a little less focus on point solutions, although at the same time, consider equitable opportunities and outcomes. So we need to take that into account as well. So, and some point solutions, may fall into that. Enable flexibility with investment strategies, and then ensure that whatever we do is, can be measured and tracked and that it's transparent. So I promise I'm just going to talk through one more slide, and then we're going to start diving into the nuts and bolts and the details. From the filtering criteria, we tweaked this a little bit since last time. One was understanding things in terms of allowability, in terms of required, but other kind of more soft filtering criteria were, we identified the requesting entity, just to be able to provide clarity for the discussion today and going forward. Whether any alternate funding existed is, as best we can see right now, and this was self-reported on the submissions, if the investment types were one-time or ongoing or required ongoing investment or support. And that one can be a little tricky. I think people mentioned last time, there may be some kind of hidden ongoing costs. We need to make sure that we're on the lookout for any of those, as well as just, what is the case? What's the evidence of need around each one of these areas? And once again, there was some information on the submissions where that was self-reported, but in some of these areas, we're probably going to need to dive a little bit deeper as well. So now finally on slide 11 is where we start taking all of those criteria and considerations and start looking at the how things profiled in terms of, state ideas versus local ideas. And what you found, and we also broke it against the categories that we'd identified earlier: facilities modernization, which is a few pieces in it, IT infrastructure, safety and security, and continuity of operations. Within each one of those four focus areas, we also break it down a little bit more. And I think it's going to be up to this panel to decide kind of what level it wants to define recommendations at as they go up to the Spark Executive Committee, but we'll leave that for a little bit later. But it shows that here, once again, the bulk, at least from a funding standpoint, was really around the kind of state level ideas. I'm not going to take too much time on this because we're going to just continue to dive into these at a greater level of detail. So the next slide, and I won't even dive in here at a great level of detail, this just shows, here's what we have from the state level. So just taking that left-hand side of that previous slide, blowing it out a little bit more into what fell into at a high level: facilities modernization, IT infrastructure, safety and security, and continuity of operations. So I guess, so the next slide is going to even dive more deeply into facilities modernization, and don't go there yet. Go back up in the pieces that are in facilities modernization. What components, one part of it is new construction, one part of it is renovation. And then even the projects that fall into those, so we can have kind of a granular discussion. But I guess before we dive into that, any thoughts that anyone had just around within state, these 4 broad focus areas? And, are there any kind of thoughts across the 4 areas that people have in general, or is that too high a level at this point? Just dive into the detail later. I just want to understand where even at this 4 focus area level, there's anyone has any thoughts for discussion before we dive into the details.
Hey, John, I don't know if this is the appropriate time, or maybe this would be more when we're having the discussion on some of the items that were submitted. But would it help us to filter through the applications by the allowability of whether or not they would be subject for approval under the ARPA Funds Act? And I would say that'd be an easy way of filtering through some of the applications where if they were potentially not allowable or not applicable, just taking them out of the equation. Because obviously it was assessed that most likely under the language of the ARPA funds, they would not be allowable to use the funds for those purposes. And then that way we can extract those out of the discussion and then focus on the ones that were allowable, somewhat allowable, and likely allowable.
Yeah, let me ask, I agree that makes sense. Let me ask the support team, were there many things on the following deep dive slides that didn't at least have a path to allowability?
Say that again.
As we go into the following slides, which are kind of deep dives in every area and has specific projects in it, are there many things on those slides? I was asking the support team that really are there, but they really don't have a pathway to allowability.
No, there were not a significant number of submissions, even those that were currently framed as likely not allowable, that don't have a pathway to allowability if it's a program that the panel wants to.
Yeah, I think this is it. This is the area where probably most of the things might be allowable, and there could be a pathway to making them allowable if the panel thought strongly about it. So I don't think we included things on the following slides that couldn't be made allowable.
So when I'm looking at the spreadsheet, it says somewhat allowable.
Mm-hmm. Would
that go through under Chairman Waymaster's philosophy, or are we just going to call out all of them that are even somewhat questionable?
I think the approach that we're taking now is that if it's an important enough area and it's not outright not allowable, we're going to continue to look at it and try and if a pathway to allowability exists, we can work to make it allowable.
Okay, thank you.
John, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
Okay. When you look at this list, something that jumped out at me, like the KDHE's building a lab for $65 million. I was kind of surprised that wasn't on this list as a potential, because I think there's some other things we could do in the budget where this could work in here. So do we have, these are the apps. Do we just take what these apps say and that's it? Or if we look around outside of this on state structures that didn't get applied, because I thought the judicial they had plenty of time to work on this or something, because they had a lot of stuff in here and there are some other ones that didn't have anything. So just a thought.
Yeah, we had said that, we had kind of the submissions form open, kind of the public submission form, but we also realized that as the panel itself brainstorms, if it brainstorms something that it wants to add here based on, that's maybe a little less applicable here than some of the other areas. That, certainly things could be added over time. In terms of thinking about it, in terms of the specific project, I don't know what precedent would set or not. I mean, I'd be more inclined to say if the panel chairs want to let it, if there's, to look at it, then we should. But I say that, but don't want to open up a Pandora's box. But what do you think, Representative Waymaster?
Well, and I was going to go back to Mark's question first, and then I'll go to the senators. Initially, what I was going through after I was going through all the 140 some applications that we had, and to sift through these, and basically extracting the ones that were identified as potentially not allowable and not allowable, leaving the ones for discussion that were allowable, somewhat allowable, and likely allowable. So they would just be extracting those that were identified as being not allowable, or there's also one that was not applicable, which there was no information given, just a dollar amount. Well, that one can already be taken out because it was the Department of Commerce in regards to the public broadcasting upgrades. There's already another application for the same amount for the same needs. So we can already take that $26.7 million out and not have to discuss that. Now, in regards to, if I heard the senator's question correctly, this would be the way I think we should move forward with this. All the information should have been submitted in the application. So we need to take it for the face value as it was submitted and not get into conjecture of trying to see what they were meaning or where they were wanting to go or what they wanted to do or trying to alter the application in any way. The application is what it is, and it has to stand on itself. And that's what we have to look at. We can't get in, I don't think we should be getting into subjectivity and seeing, okay, well, I think this is what they meant. So let's go down that way. I guess, unfortunately, we have to take the application as was submitted by the entity and go from there.
Okay.
This is Joe. I might ask to the senator's question as well. Maybe to staff. Was the lab from KDHE identified prior to us coming to the 730 million? I remember there was a list that included some funding programs or items before we got to the $730 million mark, and I vaguely recall the lab for KDHE being identified in that list.
Did that stay here or go to, that didn't go to health and education, did it?
John, so last legislative session, there was language added that if there was federal money for the state lab or for docking, that they should be funded out of federal money. So those commitments for both the state lab and docking have already been taken care of before this list was put together. So those allocations have already been through the process.
We came right here and you, Kathy.
Now you can, I think.
Yep.
So granted, I missed the last half hour of last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever the last meeting was. So if this was covered, I'm sorry. So I'm getting a lot of general, hold on a second, Troy's turning his down so we don't have an echo. Is that better now?
Yeah, somewhat, yeah.
Okay, anyway, this is a broad question, not really pertained, but I don't know when to ask. I'm getting an awful lot of questions about the higher ed decision, and they're asking me because I'm on a Spark committee. So it appears that the higher ed portion has been pulled out, and I don't really know how to answer them because initially people were directed indeed to apply through that education and higher ed and education committee. I'm sorry, health and education committee. So what's the plan there, the reasoning? And like I said, I'm sorry if I missed the answer last week. I
Yeah,
left a tad early.
It was that the innovation campuses for higher ed?
I believe, I think that was part of it, but I don't know if
Yeah.
that was all of it.
On those submissions, we put them in economic revitalization because that group is probably the best positioned to think about it, because they're generally thinking about innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystems. So they're probably going to have the mindset that would, kind of value that more than, the health and education panel is really focused more on kind of health and education outcomes.
Okay,
So we moved it to that other one because we felt it actually would get a better hearing in that.
Okay, so just to make sure I understand, any education that's not kind of related to outcomes has been moved. They haven't deleted them. They just simply moved those to the other committee.
Yeah, if they're about like health and education support, and kind of pure like the outcomes around health and education, they stayed in health and education. But the innovation focused ones, mainly kind of those innovation campuses in higher ed, we moved to the economic revitalization panel.
Okay,
Just
I think a lot
because
of,
it's in the context of what they're really looking at.
okay, I just think some people were concerned their requests they'd been working on would get lost somehow.
Yeah, no, that was really intentional because we wanted to make sure that it was going in front of the group that was like really going to be talking about that issue.
Okay, thank you very much.
Representative Waymaster, in the context of wanting to filter, by, whether it's always allowable or has a pathway to allowability or never allowable, I really don't think there are things in here that are many things that are never allowable. But we can certainly, as we talk about them, kind of reference those things. It's just going to be, we kind of like have a structured deck now. So let's talk about them as we go through, and we can knock them out. On every single one of these slides, we can knock anything out, whether it's an entire category or a specific, project area. We can knock them out or emphasize them as we go, depending upon, what you want to do. We kind of have all the data in front of us.
Well, and this is just my personal opinion, when I was going through some of the submissions and then sliding over to see what the allowability were. To me, some of them that were not allowable at all, I really don't think we need to have the discussion, because it was, building a city hall, or it was like the Armory in Hayes. Those are items that are not going to be falling under the language of the ARPA funds. And I just feel like they should just be excluded right off the bat.
Okay.
We don't need to be having the discussion.
Agreed.
Because again, like I said before, we have to look at these applications as they were submitted.
Mhm.
And it's not really fair to other submissions if we start altering one to go from a path of not allowable to somewhat or allowable, because we're distorting the application as it was submitted to us. If it's already been identified as not allowable, I don't think we need to have a discussion on it. It needs to be excluded. And this is up to the advisory panel. So if anybody has differing thoughts, please, we can have the discussion. But I just don't think we need to have a discussion on the items that have already been identified as not allowable under the ARPA funds. I think the senator is one to talk.
We can't hear you, Senator Fack.
He's still talking.
We can't hear you, Senator Fack. No, still can't hear you. Okay, now.
Now you can. I got the button. I was talking to myself. I agree with Representative Waymaster on the deal. I was wondering if we actually had a sheet that had the stuff that was allowable, and then maybe a sheet that's not allowable. where somebody might want to go back and try to build a case for that. You know, you was talking about most of them was with some work. That way we don't focus on that. We focus on the list that the chairman's talking about.
Get it. Well, as we go through these slides, we can just knock them out as we go. So,
Yeah, it's easier to look at that way.
okay.
So John, this is Frank. Question, and this might be for Whit O'Brien's. So let's talk about the Adjutant General Emergency Management Facility. That was one of the items on here. It's listed as somewhat allowable. What went into that factor? Was it the amount of information they provided, lack of information? I guess I'm trying to understand what puts some of these projects in each one of these categories that were kind of on the fence.
So with something like the Emergency Operations Center, a percentage of the project that was directly related to the COVID response activities would be allowed. So if it's, COVID has been 25% of their mission, 50% of their mission, whatever that number is, then that portion would be somewhat allowable. If you went down another road through the provision of government services, which is another allowability category, then potentially 100% of it would be allowable. So there's several different allowability streams, and depending on what stream you go down, either percentages of it or all of it would be allowable. A good example might be, laptops, computer replacements. If it's laptops that are for promoting telework due to the COVID response, it would likely be allowable. If it's laptops just because of, they've reached end of life and you need to replace laptops for the sake of laptops, that wouldn't be allowable. So I wish there was a very black and white definitive list, but there really isn't with the ARPA guidance.
Thank you.
All right. We can do that cut later, but I would suggest kind of we get going in the next slides, and then we can make a check and say, okay, was this fulfilling or not? Do we think it's the right type of discussion to be having? But let's get into the details and start having the discussions at that level. So on this slide, what I'm going to let you do is, this is that for we have the state and local, and then within state we had the 4 program areas. And so the first one was state facilities modernization, and we group that into kind of programmatic areas, which was looking at the things that were new facilities development and where there were kind of specific projects, highlighting them, and then looking at facilities upgrades and maintenance and renovation, once again highlighting them. And then a third kind of category of stuff was state universities, facilities demolition and renovation. So we looked at them in terms of pathway to allowability, investment type, is it a one-time use of funds, there's alternative funding, what were the evidence for need that was suggested. And so for each one of these, wanted to get a feel for, after you've had a chance, maybe take a couple minutes to absorb it. So maybe at like 2:36, 2:37, start talking about which of the programmatic areas appears to be the most important to include in facilities modernization. What type of anchor projects or investments should the panel consider within them? And we've identified them. Where do we need additional information or evidence? And how do you see that align with the SPARK guiding principles? So for instance, I believe the last time we were talking, there was, I think at least one person commented is, we should really look more at renovation than new facilities construction. Potentially that would be a area to talk about on this slide, but why don't people kind of take a look at it? And then we can come back and have that conversation. So the thought is, we're looking at them and saying, those whole categories, new facilities development versus renovation, how do we think about those against each other? And then even in new facilities development, do we think differently around some of the things in there versus other things?
Well, I'm probably looking at probably the largest item under new facilities development, which is the establishment of Career Center campus at all 9 Kansas Department of Corrections operated facilities with a price tag of $149.28 million. And it is potentially not allowable. I mean, so that is one that I've been reading the description and the application. I don't see where it fits with the state federal relief funds or the ARPA funds. And I really think that 149 million needs to be pulled out.
Okay. Check. By the way, we're capturing notes on the side. We're going to reflect all this stuff. Any other thoughts around the new facilities development items?
This is Joe. There's a comment under investment type that says agencies to own maintenance and operations. Does that apply to everything in this category? And I ask that question because that is, I think, an inference to the fact that it's assumed that there are ongoing costs to everything in here.
Yeah, they'd be required to do that. Yeah.
So again, sort of to go back to the beginning of the meeting today and conversation that we had in the last 2 meetings, is that something that's going to run aground in the executive committee?
If it was really significant numbers and it wasn't built into, a budget already, then yeah, it probably would be a negative. I couldn't say whether it would always be on its face rejected, but yeah, it would face some headwinds potentially.
See, Joe, that's a really good point to make, because that's what the executive committee is probably going to be looking at, because they have been identifying these funds as one-time spending with long-term results.
Yep.
And if there is going to be any type of impact in future years on the state budget, I think it's going to be problematic for that particular submission.
Yeah.
Just to tag on to that, I think that's, history has shown that they don't take care of them. They don't budget for those, and somewhere down the road, the state is asked to step up and put in additional money. So I'd echo what Representative Waymaster is saying, that could be a red flag. Now, the caveat to that is that if it's a renovation, I think that's different than building a new building. If they're going to enhance their ability, like the law enforcement training center, I'm trying to remember what I read on that one. I read so much of this. But I mean, if that's an already ongoing entity that's training our law enforcement agencies, and so some of that operating costs and the like is already baked into the budget.
So with the approach that you'd want to take on this, just kind of cutting to the chase, is that in new facilities development, if there is significant new ongoing costs, that would be kind of filtered out?
That's what that'd be where I'd lean. See what
I think that's what I
Troy
hear.
thinks. Yeah.
Anyone, Representative Waymaster, anyone else think differently?
Well, and I agree with Mark. We don't want to put new facilities on the state expense side as far as the budget. So, like I was pointing out, the new career readiness or whatever with the Kansas Department of Corrections, that wasn't allowable. The $20 million armory in Hayes, which was actually submitted in the governor's budget, They just went
Mhm.
ahead and submitted it to here to see if we could get federal money for it. But again, that was identified as potentially not allowable. I think we need to be aware of the new facilities that we may be putting on the state's books and actually address the ones that we currently already have ongoing expenses and not adding any additional strains to the state budget in future years.
Okay.
Yeah, John, I would just go back to the question I asked though. Are we sure that everything that's been identified in this area has those ongoing expenses, to go back to Mark's question?
Yeah.
Like, for example, KLETC.
We can go back and check.
Okay.
And make sure on all of these. Mhm.
I think, clearly I look at the career centers, work release centers, that they're wanting to add to their program. That's clearly going to grow corrections and have annual costs associated with the operations of those. So, wow, it may be a great idea. I don't think they qualify here. So I agree with Troy.
Okay. We can go back and check on these. And certainly the ones that would be kind of more clearly in the allowability bucket and kind of report back to the panel on that. On the second area, facilities, upgrades, maintenance, and renovation. And there are two groupings here. There is the HVAC replacements and maintenance and renovation.
How much was the judicial, John? I couldn't find that in here. What part of the 65 million is that?
Well,
I'm going
the
to have to ask someone on the support team who's kind of got that at their fingertips.
Well, Senator, were you asking about the HVAC upgrades for corrections?
Yeah. Well, no, I was asking. No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was going to say that figure is 92 million.
Okay. I was looking under facilities upgrade, the 65 million. It's got different than it's got judicial mentioned under there. There's a big number in that 65 million somewhere. So I just trying to figure out what that was.
Anyone from the support team have a feel for the components of the 65, more specifically the size of each component?
65 million.
That state school of the blind and deaf, guys, I've been around that. And I thought it was like 3.2 million. It wasn't a big number. I have seen that stuff and that needs to get done. So
These are just the ones people have asked for. I think Frank would probably attest to the fact that this is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to mechanical systems that need to be replaced on state agencies and buildings. It's a huge number. And I'm not saying, I got to start addressing it somehow, but that's just, that looks like a big number, but I think at the end of the day, I'm not sure it's going to put that big of a dent in maybe Frank would just address it better.
Well, so the feedback I've gotten from that 65 is that 56 million of that maintenance is tag expenses. Judicial is 2.1 million in terms of facilities upgrades, maintenance renovation for the state defense building. So, to your point, Mark, because where you're getting at is that where the panel could decide with a little shaping is to say, I really don't want to focus on new facilities development. I really do believe in the kind of facilities upgrade maintenance, particularly on the HVAC piece. And I know that it's going to be more than the 65. And so I want it to be kind of 80 to cover kind of a full look at what the needs are there. If it turns out that there isn't needs for everything, it comes back into the fund. But you could craft state facilities modernization to focus squarely on that, right?
This is Frank. One concern I had with, for example, the corrections, $90 million of air conditioning for correctional facilities. And what is an occupied facility? Again, back to my comment last week, is that feasible between now and 2026 with the amount of design, construction, movement? Is that too big of a ask? I mean, it's a worthwhile project, but are we trying to take on too much with one large ask? And could that be accomplished realistically?
Sure. Good point.
I'll tell you now, I ordered air handlers back in July. They're still not here yet. Hopefully things are going to improve, but that's just, everybody needs them, but you just can't get them. And hopefully that'll improve over the next 12 to 18 months, but it's an awful lot of work here.
Okay. Let me move on to the state university facilities and renovation. Facilities demolition and renovation.
So it's not going to surprise you that I like that one. So, I mean, because it clearly is eliminating cost, annual ongoing running costs when you take a building down. We've got pretty solid data that says our universities are underutilized, and we've got significant deferred maintenance backlog on buildings that really are past their useful life. So, I mean, it's kind of a twofer. You eliminate deferred maintenance and you increase your classroom and your building efficiency use as you take square footage out of the system. So that's the thought behind that one.
The only thing that concerns me about that, Mark, is that it's been defined as potentially not allowable.
Yeah, and I'm trying to, I mean, I don't. I'm
And I
trying
don't know if there's
to figure out
anybody
why.
from the office of recovery that can give us an assessment as to why it was defined as potentially not allowable. But
Yeah,
I mean,
that-
it'd be hard for us to go to the Spark Executive Committee with an item that's been deemed as not allowable.
I totally agree. But I was surprised it's not allowable, but maybe they could enlighten us on that.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah, so ARPA is at its core a response to COVID. So it's about adding capacity, adding resources, and not about restructuring or necessarily improving efficiency or making things more economical. There is potentially a path forward through the provision of government services, which is this catch-all. But on its face, a project like that does not add net capacity for responding to the pandemic. And that's sort of important to remember that these are, this isn't state general fund, it's state and local fiscal recovery funds as it's related to the COVID pandemic. So everything sort of needs to be linked back to that somehow.
So I have a question on that. This is Shane. Because I've heard that said, I've not read it anywhere where it has to be specific to COVID. And I guess where I'm going with that is I see things like HVAC renovation, and to save money, basically, right? I don't know how that, so if I'm trying to compare that with the power factor correction, I'm not sure that I understand the full distinction. And so go ahead. I'll let you answer.
So with something like HVAC, it's the pathway for allowability is not cost savings to the state when it comes to ARPA. It's improved ventilation as it is a mitigation factor related to COVID. So when I'm providing an allowability assessment, it's as it relates to the ARPA guidance, not the intent behind the request.
So so that does bring up another point then. So when we're evaluating these, it should be based on some measure, not in terms of dollars saved. Because that's what's kind of confusing is in the submittal, you want an ROI, it asks specifically for an ROI. It doesn't say, okay, how are you going to measure the improved circulation or ventilation of air? And so is that what we need to be focused on then? We need to change our view to something related to other than money? Or a return, a measurement that is not based on a return of investment, but a measurement of some other, factor that somehow relates to the spreading perhaps of COVID?
I'm not sure this advisory panel needs to be concerned with that. I mean, certainly, you can look at these projects through different lenses, one of the lenses being cost effectiveness, efficiency, deferred maintenance, that sort of thing. You can also look at it through, COVID response. On the back end, when grant awards are actually issued to any of these potential recipients, that is when we would, collect the necessary data from a compliance and reporting responsibility. But I don't think you necessarily need to, be looking at it from a, indoor air quality pollution lens at this point.
Well, we kind of do, right? Because if you're asking us to choose them, we have to have a basis by which to choose. So that's what I'm asking is how do we say which one is better if we don't have the measuring stick?
And I think that's a different, I'll defer to John. I think that's a different conversation than allowability. So, whether there's a pathway or not is one topic. Comparing apples to apples is another one.
Yeah, on the submission forms, and once again, it's a lot of very different types of things we're looking at. We ask for target outcomes, not ROIs. So we didn't ask people to calculate an ROI. In terms of what we select, the things that should be selected are things that could be allowable and that we think are going to have the greatest long-term impact on Kansas. So that could take efficiency into account. It's just the efficiency piece isn't going to be the thing that we're going to use on the back end to justify the accountability.
Okay, so help me out then on that. I get it. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm really just trying to, because I've never fully understood it. Because when I read everything, it says response to COVID, but yet many of these things, you could argue whether it's really a response to COVID or not, right? I mean,
you could make an argument for it, but that may not be the primary driver of its impact for the state of Kansas. But with regards to the Treasury guidelines, you could say, yeah, it does serves a purpose against, the impact of the COVID epidemic. Sure.
okay, I'll just keep noodling it and thinking
Sure.
about it.
Yeah,
Thanks.
some of this stuff is a bit of an art for me too, because before December, I wasn't aware of any of this stuff. So, it definitely is. That's why we have the experts on board to help us think it through. I guess to summarize, I guess Mark and Representative Waymaster, because once again, we're just trying to bring information to the table. The decision making really is up to the panel. what do you think, what's your feeling for kind of where we're leveling out against this particular programmatic area?
Well, look, I understand the kind of the primary COVID thing, but it's really going to boil down to what kind of a lens that the committee, the Spark committee wants to look at some of this through. Because I'm looking at some of these things parked as allowable that, it's a stretch, I think. You can maneuver your logic to about justify anything. I spent 4 years in Topeka. I know how that works. But that's really, I think, I'm not sure that it's going to be any clearer after we're done talking about it than it is today. Right now.
Yeah,
And I'm okay with that. I don't have to have absolute clarity on that. I can, if the chair wants to, and I have a hard time arguing that, getting rid of the ones that are fuzzy are a good way to get, to whittle the list. I can't argue that that's not a good way to do it. And so that's kind of where I'm at on this.
Yeah, my argument would be that the Spark Executive Committee is going to really err on the side of impact. And if they say something's really high impact and you could have a pathway to allowability, then they would probably place a lot of emphasis on that. I think they're really looking at long-term impact.
John, not only the Spark Executive Committee, but also the State Finance Council is going to have the same exact mentality as well.
Yeah, they're going to be thinking impact.
Yes.
So what I'd say is look at this, and if something is totally not allowable, knock it out. But what in this area do is the feeling of, is this generally a high impact area, and what portions of it are really high impact if you were going to kind of craft what a recommendation here looked like, just kind of directionally.
Yeah.
Am I?
Well, I won't.
I would.
So if on the State University deal, but I appreciate those insights.
I would say in regards to this programmatic area, we just focus on facility upgrades, maintenance, and renovation, and move forward with those items that have been classified under that subsection for this area. Because as we discussed, and I think Mark mentioned this before, we don't really want to put new facilities online. As he mentioned, we're not very good stewards of the buildings we already have. So I don't think we need, I don't want to look at new facility development. But obviously the ARPA funds derived from COVID-19. So there has to be some type of element or connection in regards to COVID. And I think the ones that focus on that particular component are the items that have been classified under facility upgrades, maintenance, and renovation.
Great. Awesome. Does that ring true to everyone else?
It works for me.
Let's go to the next slide. So hopefully we've done a lot of kind of, pressure testing around how to think about it. I'll let you guys think about on the state IT infrastructure area. I'll let you read that for a couple more minutes and then kind of engage in the same type of discussion.
Well, as I mentioned before, I think in my earlier comments, it has 52 million for public broadcasting commerce, and that actually can be cut in half because we had two submissions, one from the Department of Commerce and then one from the public broadcasting partners. So actually that amount should just be 26.7 million from what I was reading from the submissions.
Awesome. We can do that. We'll check on it just to make sure, but we can do that for sure. All right, coming back, now that people have had a chance to look at it, technical infrastructure, appreciate the direction on that around the public broadcasting. Any other general thoughts around the technical infrastructure area?
I would, this is Joe, I would offer that these both, well, technical infrastructure in particular, also to some extent digital government, and probably more so cybersecurity. A lot of these are very similar to facility upgrades, maintenance, and renovation. We're talking about a lot of deferred, after going through the list, a lot of deferred cost, things like technical debt, which are similar to like deferred maintenance in Frank's world. I think a lot of the submissions here really fit into that mold. At least looking at things like what judicial put in, some of the things that revenue put in. You know, there are just costs that have been built up over time, and it looks like a lot of the submissions, folks are trying to do like a one-time catch-up, and these are costs that a lot of these organizations seem to already be incurring over time. They don't seem to be additions. There may be exceptions to that, but I didn't see a whole lot of them.
I really appreciate those comments because I agree 100%. One of the kind of words I've heard from some of the Spark members are, they're looking for catalytic impact. They're looking for this money to go towards something that's not just going to maintain the status quo of how we operate our government and do things, but they're looking for something, for things that are going to have an impact on a better way to do things, a new way. And I don't see that in a lot of this stuff.
Just to capture the earlier thought, were you saying that a lot of these things are happening? They just haven't been able to kind of fully cover the investments that are made, or that these are projects that have been on the list for a while and have just been deferred from happening because they just haven't made the cut in recent years?
At least some of them seem to be things, not that they're projects like replace this or replace that, but they're things that have needed to be done. You look like just the concept of digitization of data, for example. Yeah. That's something that has been on the books for a lot of these agencies for a long time in strategic planning, yeah. Even if there hasn't been a specific project to move this system or that process or that effort forward. This is maybe an opportunity for those organizations to do exactly that, because they haven't had the funding or the focus to be able to do it in the past. It's sort of a shot in the arm to move that forward. So I would offer that under digital government, where you've got process modernization and digitization of data, those in themselves are kind of sub-programs really under digital government. Mm-hmm. And then under technical infrastructure, interoperability and hardware equipment, those things I think probably more likely align with the concept of deferred maintenance, and are probably more likely to include and seem more to include things that have been deferred because of time or resources or what have you. And then cybersecurity, I would offer that cybersecurity is just something that we as a state have not had the resources to effectively engage in some ways for the things that have been identified under these particular requests. So it's not really a deferred maintenance thing as much as it is more similar to digitization of data, if that makes sense.
I guess as I look at it, once again, I don't want to overstep the bounds of facilitating versus thinking about taking positions on the content, but it almost seems to me like putting the public radio piece aside, on the technical infrastructure piece, that could be stuff that could happen in the context of the budget. The big idea here that could actually be transformative around efficiency and modernization, depending upon how you approached it, is actually the digital government piece. The cybersecurity piece isn't necessarily transformative, it's just a risk.
Well, I don't know that I would use the word just.
Well, it's a risk. Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't want to be on the record as saying just a risk. But I mean, I remember Representative Waymaster, you were even talking before around digital government, around just the level of inefficiency and around the Kansas resident facing, external facing, web pages of the agencies.
But yeah, I mean, we need to modernize our web presence for the state of Kansas. I mean, plain and simple. We had an efficiency study that was done in 2015, and I identified that as being one of the items that we needed to focus on. But it's going to cost a lot, and that's how government needs to move forward. We're moving into a digitized era, and Kansas hasn't been following that projection very well. So I would say, and one thing that we also need to go through, because we talked about some of this may need to come out of the state budget, and some of this maybe could be used for the ARPA funds. But if Amy is on, and Kathy Wolfmore, Representative Wolfmore is in my office right now, we were just discussing this. But in regards to the Kansas Department of Labor, was there only one submission or is there two? John, you remember?
I don't have the database in front of me, so I'd have to ask.
Well, I have one of their submissions right here, which is they want $10 million to add staff support. And that concerns me because is that going to go away?
Yeah.
So are we going to be using federal dollars as a one-time way to get staff support, but then that's going to be a long-term expense that we're going to be covering on the state budget?
Mm-hmm.
The other item, and I was looking for it and I can't find it, but I didn't know if they wanted additional funds for the update on the legacy program and getting rid of that computer program and then moving on to something else. But last year in the budget, we met their request of $42 million for that new program. And that's what Representative Wolfmore and I were remembering. So if there's additional funds that are wanting for that new software program, I don't really know why they're asking for it because we met their request last year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Labor had a request too under line item 90 for a KDO call center phone system upgrade to hire statewide employees to address labor. It's line item 90 on that sheet.
What was that, Frank? 190?
I'm seeing 90, but maybe it's 190. It's a KDOL call center phone system upgrade, 0.4 million. Statewide impact to hire people across the state to serve as call center.
It looks to me like that's to upgrade the system, not to hire people.
Well, it says under description, column K, it talks specifically about flexibility to allow hire state across the state staff, not just a Topeka call center.
I'm guessing that's a soft phone system so that they can allow people to answer phones and not have to be in a specific location.
Right. In a physical call center.
Chairman Waymaster, a question I have is, and this is a general question. As we go through this, we're not trying to spend the 740 million. We might end up with 100 million, right?
Right.
Let the group come together. So if we hit something, we got a question in, it's okay to say no. I mean, if we don't add up to the number, we're okay.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, like in the previous slide that John had shown of the $13 billion in requests, and we only have $721 million left. And this advisory panel was by far, we only had $900 million in requests. I mean, we're going to have to be very selective on what we move forward with the Spark Executive Committee, because I'm just going to say this right now. The amount that we get approved is going to be far less than the other 3 advisory committees. And the reason why is because the amount of the submissions that we received and the dollar amounts that we received were far less than economic revitalization, connectivity, and health and education. And so we need to be very selective on how we move forward with these. And we want to make sure that what we do submit to the Spark Executive Committee are things that are going to pass that committee and then pass the State Finance Council and actually come to fruition.
Yeah. On this slide, it seemed to me, with taking that lens, that there's probably something to potentially be, I mean, eventually it can be scored, is something around the efficiency and modernization around digital government, to think about what that could be. And if there's something there that could be crafted, looking at the submissions that, really is something just the state wouldn't get at on its own through the normal course of business, that could be transformative. And then the public broadcasting piece. But the other stuff to me seems like it may not, float to the top necessarily. And I don't know, Representative Wayne, you had more context around the public broadcasting piece.
Well, I know that when we were in the pandemic and we had CARES 1 Act money, and the public broadcasting, they did not submit or they didn't request any money to be reimbursed back from the Spark Committee at that time, but they had partnered with the Department of Education, the Kansas Department of Education, during the pandemic in getting instructions and educational knowledge out to their viewers, namely students that were at home. And they had some costs that they did incur with that. But they had chose not to ask for those funds back from the Kansas Department of Education. I was more than willing to reimburse them back for the expenses that they had for the instructional knowledge that they provided for those students when they were out of school, either during the time of the pandemic in March or in the summer. But they actually banded together across the state of Kansas and provided education throughout the state with their particular stations, and providing that during the pandemic. And so they do have aged towers and other equipment across the state of Kansas. That is, if they're going to, God willing, we have another pandemic that we have to find ourselves in, they would probably follow the same path they did last year and 2 years ago, and providing that education for the students across the state of Kansas, as they did when they partnered with the Kansas Board of or State Department of Education.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think that's a great point. I would add to that, if we're going to be extending services with investments here as sort of an overall portfolio, talking about things like process modernization or digitization of data, and providing folks resources to improve those services or replace systems, looking at technical infrastructure, some of that stuff is, I think, also critical. I think it's from a policy perspective a mistake not to consider protecting those investments with cybersecurity investments. Some of those requests under cybersecurity specifically speak to protecting, like what you were talking about, Mr. Chair, education piece, right? Extending out education resources. We have a big hole in the state when it comes to cybersecurity and investment and policy around that. And I think it would be a mistake not to at least consider that as a partner investment with anything else we do in this area.
I mean, to be quite honest, I kind of started my comments with how I would like to modernize the web presence of the state, but really, I think this should be our focus in moving the state forward. And if we do find ourselves we're in a lockdown like we did in 2020, citizens of Kansas still needed to access items from the state of Kansas. And I think moving this forward in whatever relay it may be, I think this should be our real focus in with this advisory panel. I just wanted to make those comments because I think this is one way that we can protect and also do a better service for our citizens is if we digitize our platform all over the board for the state of Kansas.
So just to make sure I got that right, you're seeing state IT infrastructure as a category with the right shaping of these pieces within it is kind of a sweet spot.
I would say that, yeah, that's my preference. I mean, obviously there's others on the advisory panel, but I mean, as far as what the ARPA funds can be used for, I think this is, and not to say that we're not going to use the funds that we have available for other needs. We will. We'll have those discussions, but I really think this should be a focus of ours.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? And once again, we can shape it, right? We still have a month though.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Troy, I note that, part of that digitalization is Department of Labor has a pretty significant ask in that bunch, I believe. I mean, where's the committee stand on the fact that they've already, channeled some pretty significant funds? How's that going to play into those awards? I guess?
Well, that's a very good question, Mark.
And do we need to adjust the 77 million? I mean, I'm guessing we're not going to be taking things in or out because that's not our job. We're just going to say, look at the ideas under digital government, and we recommend you do those.
Most likely, yeah. But I would say there will be this negative connotation, I guess, with the Kansas Department of Labor in what transpired in the last 2 years in regards to the I guess the responses back to the legitimate claims that Kansans had. And then we also had the fraudulent activity that went on, the loss of $700 million from the unemployment trust fund that was paid out as fraudulent claims. And I mean, I can't speak for the members of the executive committee, but I think that's going to have a bearing on anything that might be looked at for the Department of Labor, especially after we gave $42 million last year to the upgrade of their system. So hopefully this wouldn't happen.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
The one thing I'd say in this area, though, is that when you talk about kind of digital government and digitizing services and getting more commonality potentially across the agencies, there could be a point that if all of these submissions came in individually, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, there may be an opportunity to step back and say, well, if we looked at it in an integrated sense, we might think about it a little differently than every individual submission. Can't hear you, Representative Waymaster.
I would say actually we probably could group some of these together. Obviously, that's what's been done. I mean, we've taken the individual submissions and then put them together into different categories. I think they stand together better together than separate.
Yeah. Oh, I agree with that. But when you looked across and you said, we want to do these 7 things, you might actually step to the side and say, if you're thinking about doing all those 7 things, might you actually think about it a little differently? Could there be some common platforms that you might think about? Don't know.
Well, I think there could be a common theme, yeah.
Yeah.
And that might cascade from one agency or department to another.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's got your feedback on that one. Let's go to the next one, just kind of in the interest of time. Once again, I'll let people look at this for a couple of minutes and then we can discuss. But, this was, getting into a lot of the issues around, this was where some of the radio replacement issues came in. in some other areas in that first emergency response one, and the second one's around physical security enhancements. Smaller ticket stuff, but
Mr. Chairman, one thing that catches my eye, like that patrol aircraft, that was in the budget. And back to my
Yes, it
lab
was.
deal, that was in the budget too. So it's kind of interesting. This got to the list and the lab didn't. So I just reading over that part of it. So
Well, the lab's already been approved by the State Finance Council.
that should be a good thing too, shouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, but it's approved, and we're using federal dollars for that. Yeah, I was trying to pull up the Highway Patrol's 4 aircraft that they're wanting to purchase.
There's
And
3.
Yeah, that's was it 3 or 4?
It was 3 and then 800,000 improvement on a 4.
Okay. For the flares.
I don't know about that part. I don't remember that.
Anyway, so if I remember right, when I was looking through the submission, I can't find it right now, but I believe they said that was not allowable or potentially not allowable. I do know that when I had conversations with the Kansas Highway Patrol, it's in the budget, subject to see whether or not this is approved through the Spark funds. And so the Highway Patrol told me that they were going to go ahead and submit an application for this. So it's in both places. It's here with us, and then it's also in the state budget. And so right now, it's in both. I'll just say that, I guess, best way I can put it.
Okay, now you made a statement, Mr. Chairman, about the Fed money for the lab, and I'll get off of that. So that's covered, you're saying?
Yes, that's covered. I believe we voted on that in December to use the ARPA funds that we had available for the KDHE lab and also renovation of docking. And John, correct me, I believe that was 92 million.
Thank you. That helps me. Okay.
I don't know. That sounds about right. I don't know. Top of line.
And so, yeah, so Senator, that's been already taken out of the 1.6 billion that we received. And so right now the remaining 721 million is what
Gotcha.
we have not spent. So
Thank you.
I guess, against what are the things that are falling in here, kind of, similar to our discussions in some of the other areas? How do people generally feel about state safety and security as kind of a category of things to spend on here? And how do people feel about what's on this page?
I'm not excited about any of it. That's me.
John, do you know, I was trying to look for it and I was just asking Representative Wolfmore, what was the Capitol Complex security enhancements? You know the details of that?
Not off the top of my head. Does anyone have that?
Frank, do you have?
Yeah, I can speak to that. We did a third-party national consultant to do a full physical video assessment of our entire Capitol complex to point out the deficiencies in both our card access systems, our camera systems, and pretty much everything that provides safety and security for our entire complex. That report was then used to put this motion forward, or this idea forward, to overhaul that system.
Okay. And so that's not just the Capitol, that's also Eisenhower.
Yes, it's all of our outlier buildings, and it would be the template and the infrastructure we would need to potentially bring on some of our other state buildings here in Topeka and Shawnee County onto that framework.
All right, thank you.
Have we ever had a breach of security on any of that kind of stuff? I'm the new guy.
I can't speak to a specific example, but the report was a little discouraging, given how far we are behind on our technology and the security of our systems.
Any other kind of summary thoughts around this? Actually, I would ask anything that deviates from Senator Fagg's view. Not much gets him excited on this slide.
Well, this is Joe. I'm a little biased, being that I'm at the KBI, but I do think that some of these areas are pretty important, and should be considered, particularly when it comes to communication, either data or voice, for public safety generally in response to incidents,
Yeah.
and how they tie into the incident response system around things like pandemics and anything that might happen during a pandemic. We saw during the pandemic, I speak this a little bit. I think probably the Highway Patrol could speak to this much more than I could, or even KDEM. But we saw significant response impact or impact to our response capabilities during the pandemic because of folks being sick or out, and also because of a lowered sort of call volume on, or contact volume on the roads, impacted a lot of operations. I think the only thing here that really speaks to that would be the radio replacements. The federal requirements for going to the new encryption standard by 23 impacts all of that interagency communication, and that communication is between all of the state level criminal justice organizations or law enforcement organizations, and also their communication with locals and locals' communication with each other. They all use that same set of radio systems and standards. So it's really about communication and our operability more than it is anything else.
Great. Appreciate that. Any other kind of summary thoughts on this one before we move on? Representative Waymaster?
Well, I was trying to find the aircraft again on the Microsoft team file. But I would agree with Joe. I think if we want to focus on something, it would be the radio replacement and the Capitol complex. And those would be the two items that I would say, if we want to move forward, if the advisory panel wants to move forward on anything in regards to safety and security, I would say those are the two items that we probably need to address first.
Well, you know what, I mean, we can craft them into programmatic areas, right? And then they'll get scored against the other ones anyway, right? So it's not like saying move forward and kind of look at them. There's still another step where you're going to be able to kind of put them side by side, other things, right?
Correct.
Got it. Okay. Good discussion on that. Let's go to the next one, and this is the last one for state. Around state continuity of operations. So take a look at it and we'll start talking in a couple minutes.
So John, this is one I've got to just question on you've got the license plate replacement request as allowable.
I was going to ask the same
How in
question.
the world does that connect to COVID?
Matt?
I don't make the rules, I'm just passing it along. So in the final rule issued by Treasury, they added language about increasing public sector capacity. and they included administrative items like this and how, government works smarter, how the public interacts with government, and they made it a presumptively eligible activity. They did some other things around, criminal justice, judicial backlog, some things, not directly related to COVID, but it was included in the final rule.
Okay, this kind of stuff that makes you hold your head. So,
Well, and I was going to ask the same thing because I was reading the submission for this for 23 million for the license plate replacement. And I kind of wondered how that was allowable. I'm glad Mark went ahead and asked that question. But the next thing that I have to say in regards to this is talking about are they wanting a new design? Because they were talking about it hasn't been changed in like 12 years. I guess my opinion is, so what? I mean, I don't think we should be using the federal money to have a new design change for our license plate. The other thing is they're talking about it, that we have a standard embossed plate, and that is not true. We changed the standard embossed plate 3 or 4 years ago, Representative Wolfmore, to a digital printed flat plate that can be read by the KTA or the K tag. And that was the reason why we changed our plates. So I'm just baffled by this one. I don't know why we're even talking about it. Well, I guess we have to because it was submitted. But at the same, I agree with Mark. I don't think this has a COVID-19 relation. And then also in the application, there have been changes made to the standard license plate. It's not embossed anymore. It's flat. It's printed. It's digitally printed. And if we're just looking at having a new design for the license plate, I don't think this is an appropriate way to use ARPA funds.
Mr. Chair, if I might, I do sit on one of the advisory boards for revenue in my capacity for law enforcement information sharing with revenue. And I don't want to speak for Division of Vehicles, but I think what they might be referring to, and that this question would have to go back to them to confirm, is that the new plates that you're talking about that came out 3 years ago, they didn't actually replace, I don't think they replaced at the treasurer's offices all of the backlogs, and they didn't force people to replace their plates if they already had plates. If you have an embossed plate, you can maintain it.
You're exactly right. Yes, you can.
And I think maybe what they're talking about here is forcing people to replace all those plates with the newer plate.
Well, we could do that through legislation. We don't need to do it through ARPA funds. I mean, I just, this submission just baffles me. This is something where I don't think we need to be using ARPA funds. This is obviously, I don't think this is something that's going to move past, one, the advisory panel, two, the Spark Executive Committee. This can all be handled through legislation. If we want to get rid of the embossed license plates altogether, we can have a directive to the Kansas Department of Revenue to do that. That's just my opinion. I don't think this is a correct pathway for the changes in the license plate.
Is there anything that's housed in this, on this slide, that really kind of pulls at people or not?
I don't see anything, on the state operations support. I look at all those and say, look, if we have another pandemic event, I'm guessing there's going to be more money coming to help them with a lot of that operational support that they've already got in place. And I think all these funds would do is continue to feed the beast when maybe we don't need all of it as this winds down. So, and I'm certainly agree with Chair Waymaster on the license plate thing. The only thing that's intriguing is KBI's lab equipment replacement. But that's really the only item on here that perks my interest.
Yes, I have a question, maybe why we're still why would we be putting $1 million to PP&E at this point in time? I know when we filled these out the first time, it was last October or before, and things have changed. Most people have figured it out by now. Are we really going to spend $1 million on PPE?
That's my point. Yeah, that's exactly my point, is we're way past a lot of this stuff.
So Representative Waymaster, do we want to try and craft anything in here to then be able to put in the scoring exercise, or is this kind of an area that just doesn't make it through to the next?
Well, and I'm looking at the temporary personnel support for the judiciary and Kansas Department of Labor, and then operational supports. But I would probably focus on state operations support. The other items under equipment and materials, I agree. The $1 million for PPE. I mean, we're past that. I don't think we need to be looking at that any further. I mean, all the mandates are being lifted and mask rules and everything. I don't think we need to be adhering to that for the judicial branch. But I would say be focusing on the state operational support.
Okay. And so we can kind of craft something around that, working with
Yes.
the panel going forward, and then it just prioritizes out wherever it prioritizes out in the next step.
Yes, correct.
Got it. All right. Well, in the interest of time, I want to move now into the local. Once again, there were a decent number of submissions, but it wasn't nearly as big a dollar amount. And there was, we had kind of a couple different conversations last time around the local piece. One was, let's think about equity, if it's something that's important. I think the radios in particular came up because there was a corresponding need there. But also, if some of them are point solutions, or if there are some local funds that could be brought to bear, let's take that into account around this. So I'm going to be interested as we kind of get into it, where we end up. But why don't you go to slide 18 and let's kind of dive into it. So once again, we're going through, local facilities modernization, and there's a new facilities development piece, as well as a facilities upgrade, maintenance, and renovation piece. So I guess I'd ask on this is, look at it for a couple of minutes, and then let's really kind of talk about how we think about this, particularly in light of the other discussions we've had. So anyone want to weigh in, on this slide, or generally how we even think about the local asks? Or
Well, I think, Chair Waymaster said it before, if we start down this path, where's it end?
yeah,
So many of these are, just fairly narrow, and
Mhm.
if we fund one town hall, one fire station, we
Yep.
better be ready to fund them all. So,
I was just going to make that point again, Mark. So thank you very much. Some of these, are very specific to particular counties or cities.
Yep.
And so I think while we move forward with this, we need to peel back what the request is. If it's we had numerous counties, sheriff departments that were asking for the radios, as I think Joe mentioned before, has to be federally compliant by 2023. Is that right, Joe?
Yes, I think it's September 30th of 23.
Okay, so when we received a lot of different counties asking for that, so that's where we set up this grant fund.
Yeah.
Where all counties will have the ability to apply for it. I think we should give preference to those that brought it to our attention. But we also need to have the accessibility for all the other counties to apply for it as well. So we set up a dollar amount. We'll have to figure out exactly what that's going to be. But if it's for a new city hall or a new building or a renovation of a particular building, we need to tread very lightly on that because as Mark mentioned before, and as I mentioned in previous meetings, we open that Pandora's box. Where does it stop? I mean, we're going to have cities and counties upset because we didn't build them a new building or something like that. And then also I want to point out in the HVAC replacement, I don't know if this is where it comes into, but we had one school district that sent an application for HVAC, and I don't know if it's in this particular section or not. But one thing I would just like the advisory panel to be aware of is that in regards to what we call the ESSER funding that was received from school districts or for the state of Kansas through the school districts, for the last 3 relief packages that the federal government has passed, ESSER or CARES Act 1 was 85 million that went to K through 12 education. CARES Act 2 was $370 million that went to K through 12 education. And then the ARPA funds is $830 million that went to the state of Kansas for K through 12 education, which was then funneled down to the school districts. And sometimes the school districts receive money directly as well. So you're talking about almost $1.3 billion that has gone to the Department of Education, to the school districts. And I'm sorry, but I'm just guessing that they should have utilized those funds for an HVAC service from that school district when that money was received.
So would it be correct for me to interpret that there's probably nothing on this slide that necessarily is capturing anyone's passion or attention at this point?
To be quite honest, really not mine.
Me neither.
Okay. Let's move on to the next one. So this is the IT infrastructure review, but locally. Let you take a look at it, cybersecurity and the technical infrastructure piece. Anything here jumping out at anyone?
I see these as the same issue we have with the prior slide. Is it's just like we have so many other state requests. I have a hard time seeing these trickling down.
John or maybe staff, was there no alternate funding identified for cybersecurity for the water and wastewater treatment plant for Topeka and Olathe? I don't see it on this, but
I don't know off the top of my head. Anyone on the team know the answer to that? Yeah, I heard none identified at this point. So.
okay. I would maybe point out that there is a significant amount of Homeland Security grant funding in the local regions that is available specifically for critical infrastructure cybersecurity efforts.
Okay. Well, we'll look into that. And then, if that's true, it doesn't sound like anything on this slide would go forward either, but we'll also look into that. Does that sound right? Okay. Sorry, I know we're moving fast now, but on the next slide, local safety and security, and this is where we end up getting kind of the other side of the radio piece. And that is kind of based on kind of a federal requirement, a federal change. So I would have thought that this would have been the area local that might have gotten the most attention.
Well, in kind of thinking about this and how we want to structure this, it'd be my preference that we do a match in regards to set up like a grant fund where like we have all these different applications that we've already received, but we also open it up to all the other counties and cities that maybe want to apply for the same like product. But the counties and the cities receive money as well. And I don't think the state should be funding everything. from
Yep.
those who submitted applications. So we set up like a 50-50 match with state county money or state, however we want to set it up. But I think this is where we set up that match grant program.
Yep. Okay. Anything else on that slide before we move to the last one for local?
One thing that I might suggest on any grant program that's set up for the locals for radio is to focus on the interoperability with the state program
Mhm.
in terms of communications, and that gives you a pretty strong justification for funding that particular kind of grant program for the locals, is the interoperability with the state agencies.
Okay. Also, now, last slide. And so this is the local continuity of operations, which seem to be a lot around temporary personnel retention. Any summary thoughts on that? Not a lot on the slide, so.
I'd be a no.
I mean, go ahead, Mark.
I was just gonna say, I see that as just a continuation of a ramp up that was from COVID that we're on the backside of now, and I don't see any point in continuing to fund that.
Mhm.
Well, and I was going to say, if we're looking at $2 million for retentive initiatives for what, 3 particular counties, again, if we do that for 3, we've got to do it for the other 102. So I just don't think this is something that we want to. This isn't a path we want to go down.
Got it. Okay. Well, good. So let me, in the amount of time that we have left, we've gotten a lot of direction and guidance. Go to slide 24. I don't think we need to go unless you, okay, yeah, I guess we could summarize on this. Go back up to that one. So it looks like as we've been kind of moving things up and down and looking at what to exclude, and we've also captured the detailed conversations, here's kind of where we saw things kind of coming out in terms of the broad categories. Once again, captured the more detailed pieces as well. But does this seem like it basically captured our discussion? And once again, we need to shape and size all the things remaining and then be able to kind of prioritize them against each other. Just to check, you're still sure you don't want to do the license plate replacement?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Does this seem about right?
Yeah, it seems about right.
Okay. All right. Well, what we can do is continue to work through. Go to the next slide. We're going to be working through and we're going to need to do it kind of as homework, working with you to develop kind of the templates of what these could look like. The program description, goals, target outcomes, the things that are in them, and even like target ask and minimum ask, and that's going to be determined by the things that are in them. And then begin profiling them so that we can have a discussion when it comes time to make prioritization decisions for the panel for the next session. So we're going to be, doing this based on the input we got here and continue to kind of work it as a homework assignment. Does that make sense? Go to the next slide. Yeah, keep going. So we we had been teed up to potentially even do this live in here. Not going to try and do it now because we got a lot of good information as we went through slide by slide. So going into the next steps, once again, we're going to work on developing those with this guidance with you, and to make sure that we're able to build these out and, you know, get any other information that we need to based on the discussions that happen here. Next slide. And then, so coming up, we're also going to work to make sure that we have our kind of scoring matrix correct, working with particularly the panel chairs to make sure that we're weighting things the right way. So as we want to look at each one of these areas against each other, we're able to kind of evaluate them against the criteria and have the criteria weighted in the right way. Next slide. And so we need to schedule the next meeting, but in that next meeting, we're going to be able to kind of review where we came out here, but in more kind of looking at the program templates and be ready to kind of prioritize those ideas and figure out what bubbles to the top. And then the panel can start working on, okay, what do we want our recommendation set to look like that goes up to the Spark Executive Committee? So with that said, that leaves a little bit of time now for discussion. You know, there's going to be an exit survey as well, but any summary thoughts, requests?
John, are you going to clean up the Excel spreadsheet and kind of reorganize it based on your slides and what made the cut, what didn't? And so we've got kind of a master list there.
Yeah, we can do that. Yep.
That'd be good.
And I guess I have like kind of like a procedural question. So even though we didn't technically do it today, but we did discuss some of the items that we've said, now that probably doesn't fit within the premise of what we were trying to decide with the ARPA funds. So when we finally do make our ultimate decision for the advisory panel on that, then goes on to the Spark Advisory Committee, those that were not selected, are they going to be notified that they were not selected for any dollars?
Yeah, I think we have to tell people that either, I mean, because in some ways it's going to be, you know, not that the area wasn't important, it just didn't bubble up to the top for this use of funds, but I think we need to let people know whether their area is at least in an area that's moving forward or not. Once it gets past, probably once it gets past the Spark Executive Committee, because they're going to further pare things down.
Okay, I was just kind of wondering about that. Thank you.
John, I had a question. Under the IT infrastructure, I noticed there was a couple submissions that appear to be like a vendor is submitting for like there's a $7.5 million project. It says that it's going to benefit the state of Kansas. How are we looking at those particular ones? They're not assigned to an agency.
That was in the backup. Those are the other ones that were kind of thrown in around the other submissions, and we didn't know exactly from the feedback we've gotten from you before was to kind of pull them out, think about them differently.
Okay.
I just didn't know, you know, any guidance on how you want to approach that, I guess. You know, I guess let us know how to think about that. On a lot of these, they weren't really very targeted.
Well, and that's my concern. If it did start to move forward, where would it reside? How does it get pushed forward? I mean, a lot of them are just ideas that are put out there, but I don't know how the panel would look at that.
Yeah. I guess the question around this is, I mean, how, you know, to the chairs, how would you want to kind of approach these ones?
If they made it through it all, I think they'd have to be a competitive grant scenario that would be I think, sponsored by one of our state agencies, I'd be uneasy going directly to.
Yeah,
I agree with Mark. I don't think we should necessarily, unless it's through a grant program through a state agency, I don't think we should be allocating federal dollars to a private business, even though they submit an application.
Yeah.
I think we're setting a wrong example by doing that.
okay, got it. Well, I appreciate it. I realized this was probably a little messy and confusing at the start. So sorry for that. Hopefully it ended up okay in the end. We still have a lot of work to do, but I think we made a lot of progress in terms of kind of honing in on things. But with that, I'd ask, Mark and Representative Waymaster, any kind of thoughts at the end before we sign off?
John, I'd say thank you. I feel a lot better about this than I did going in. With you. And definitely, I appreciate kind of the clarity on direction and I'm good with things now and appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Well, I would just say I think it helps. And I know you said it was a little messy at the beginning, but I think that's how these things play out. When we start having a discussion on particular items and the submitted applications that we received, I think it's best just to have all of us talk through them and see exactly where everybody is gauging these applications and how we want to move them forward. And I think we made a lot of progress in regards to the applications that we received today. And then obviously, whenever we have the next meeting, we'll move forward on what the discussion we had today.
Right. Thank you. And thanks for your comments, Mark. I will share that with the whole rest of the team working on this, who have been kind of quiet the whole time unless we had questions. So a lot of work went into it, but really appreciate it. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll be talking to you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks all.